We're back with the Qilo Christmas ornament, the project of turning this into a 1/35th scale model. Last video we went through and painted all of the individual parts, and I've gone ahead and assembled some of the stuff. I've done as much assembly as I can while still being able to reach areas, and now it is time to start my favorite process, the weathering process. I've also dug through my spares bin and grabbed some accessories that I think I might use for this project. Accessories are a great way to add an extra touch to the scale model. So first up, we're going to start with the wheels so we can get these on the vehicle. We painted them black, and they look like brand new wheels, which is not what we want to go after here. I'm going to be using 3 different oil colors to give them some life. The Starship Filth, some black, and then this medium gray. So to do the weathering process on the tires, I'm going to have a fairly wide brush, tweezers, and some sponge. This is some polyamide sponge that I have. I get a sheet of this. It's a 2 foot by 2 foot sheet off of McMaster car. It's an inch thick, pretty squishy, but still pretty firm. And then I take some oil paint and then I dab it in a well, and using the sponge gives me the ability to create random dots of this oil color all around the tire. And then when I have those random dots on the tire, I take a brush, damp, just ever so slightly damp with enamel spirits, and I stipple the surface to blend the oils into the surface, and this is the final result. This is just purely aging the tire at this point to give it more of an aged look that looks something like this. I've done the same stippling process here, just with multiple colors, both to get the gray aging and then the brown oxidation. With the tires aged, we'll move on to rusting the exhaust. I'm using Ammo by Meg's U-Rust Oxide Grime for this. I like using this when I need to make an entire thing rusty, and I will just put some in a well, dilute it a little bit with water so it brushes on nice and easily, because out of the jar it is kind of like a paste. And then I just cover the entire thing in one uniform layer, and I let it do its thing. And here's what it looks like after it's fully dried and had time to react with the air in the environment. I also use the same product on the I-beams here, but I am also going to use the U-Rust Rust Reactor Type 1 to add some more variation to the rust, and to get even more variation, I'm going to apply it using a toothbrush and spray it onto the surface. I usually do this process outside so I don't get the rust reactor all over my workbench, so this is just an example of how the process would work. And then moving on to the smaller areas of rust and chipping, I'm going to grab my AK Interactive 3rd Gen Rust Color set. I'm going to grab the chocolate color for chipping and the dark rust color here. For the most part, I'm going to apply these colors using the sponge chipping technique, using that same polyamide foam sponge that I used earlier, and then tweezers to hold the sponge and apply the chipping effect where I want. And in this instance, I'm going to apply it mostly to the doors, around the edges of the doors, high wear areas. I like to focus a lot on how much paint I'm loading into the sponge, because I don't want to load too much that it floods the surface and you end up with a lot of rust. So I dab it a lot on my palette and make sure I'm happy with the result, trying to load the sponge as uniformly as possible. That way I don't end up with a crazy amount of rust. And then I will check the pattern once or twice, and then when I'm happy with it, I will ever so lightly dab the sponge on the surface. And I like to follow the less is more principle here, so I'll just do a little bit, and if I'm happy with it, I'll move on. But if I'm not happy with it, I will come back, get some more paint, and rinse and repeat the process until I am happy with it, because it's a lot easier to come back and add more than it is to remove the rust. And I'm just going to repeat the same process on the other door, just focusing on the corners of the door and the edges of the door here, areas that would be high wear. I'll use the same rust chipping technique here around the wheel wells, just where any stones might have been thrown up. In the bed of the pickup, I've combined both the U-rust effect as well as the sponge chipping technique, but the U-rust effect has left some white patches behind, so I'm going to grab some rust-colored oil paint, put it in a well, and cover that up. So to hide these white spots created by the U-rust effect, I'm just going to apply the rust-colored oil to those white spots, and then I'm going to blend it out, similar to how we blended the oils on the tires. A big tip for the oil stippling technique that I use a lot is to make sure that the brush is just ever so slightly damp, and to ensure it is ever so slightly damp, I take a paper towel and rub the brush back and forth several times on that paper towel to make sure it is as damp as it could be. And a nice added benefit of this technique is that it gives a transition between the U-rust effects and the paint effects from the sponge chipping technique. It also adds another color, which adds some more variation and makes it a little bit more interesting. In addition, you can also apply the rust-colored oil just like we did with the tires, that is, using the sponge to give a random application of the oil paint. Let it sit on the surface for a little bit, and then come back with a damp brush and stipple it into the surface. After it's been on the surface and dried for a little bit, you'll get nice fine dots, and then the stippling process will blend the rust out from those parts that have dried and give you a nice subtle rusting effect. To do some more targeted rust on this vehicle, I'm going to grab a 5-0 brush, and I'm also going to grab the chocolate chipping color so I can go back on some scratches I made earlier using the dark rust color. This way, with the dark color inside the light color, it gives the effect that the scratch has been there for a while. The lighter rust color is newer rust, and the darker rust color is the original scratch. Can't forget about the ZU-23-2 either, so I'm going to do the sponge chipping technique to make rust on this as well. And to finish up the rusting, I am going to take some rust-colored oil paint again and make some very fine small scratches. This probably has to be one of my favorite techniques. So using a very fine brush, I'm going to make small little dots of where I would like the scratch to be. And then using that same brush, I'm going to dampen it in white spirits, and then I'm going to drag the dots of oil paint out. I find I can make a very fine scratch using this technique, finer than what I could otherwise make using acrylic paints. In hindsight, I should have done this effect before all of the rusting, but I wasn't really thinking, and I just kind of went ahead and did the rust anyway. But we are going to do an oil dot fading effect. So I've got a bunch of colors of oil paint that are of different tones of the base color of this vehicle, and I'm just going to randomly dot them around on the surface of the model. Then grabbing the white spirits again, I'm also going to grab a number 6 brush and damp the brush with white spirits, and I'm going to rub it on my thumb just to make sure it is just damp. I don't want to see any shine from the white spirits. And then I'm just going to stipple the various different shades of oil paint into the surface. I'm going to rinse and repeat this same effect everywhere on the vehicle that is this kind of blue-gray color, just to add some tonal variation and some interest. I've done the white dots here on the high spots of the roof just to kind of fade them and give them a lighter appearance, because just, again, to add tonal variation and add visual interest into what is otherwise a very monochrome scheme. And here you can see the finished results of the rusting and the oil pin wash effect, giving a nice tonal variation to otherwise a monochrome scheme. I like to keep the effect very subtle, so I use more white spirits, but if you want a more obvious effect, use less white spirits and filter the paint less. Now we can move on to the dust effect on the wheels. And to do this, I'm going to start out by using some dust-colored oil paint and apply it into targeted areas on the wheels. We'll do pigments after this, but this really just provides a base for the weathering process and allows for some tonal variation in the dust itself. So starting out with the spare, I am going to use the sponge technique to apply the oil all over the sidewall of this tire, just because it's going to be sitting in the bed and it's going to get just dust accumulation, dust sitting on it. After I've done that, I'm going to grab some white spirits and again a number 6 round brush and stipple the oil paints into the sidewall of the tire here, blending it into the sidewall and giving it a nice random but also uniform coverage of dust. And then for the wheels actually in use on the vehicle, I am going to be targeted in my application of this dust-colored oil paint using a 5-0 brush, just applying dust anywhere where it would build up. So that's places like around the lettering of the tire and then around the actual bead seat of the tire itself. And then just as I was targeted with my application of the dust-colored oil, I'm also going to be targeted in the way that I remove it, not necessarily using the same stippling method as earlier, and using a little bit more white spirits, allowing the paint to flow around into all the crevices, almost like a dust wash. Once the oils have dried, it's time to move on to applying pigments, and I'm applying this desert sand colored pigment into the tread of the tire, really focusing on loading that tread up with plenty of pigment and not really caring about getting pigment elsewhere. I'll clean that up after I'm done applying the pigment here. Then to get some random pigment application, I'm loading up my brush and using a toothpick to kind of speckle the pigment around the face of the wheel here. And once I'm happy with my pigment application, I will use some white spirits to fix the pigment in place for now. This won't fix the pigment in place permanently, it will just allow it to kind of flow into the surface of the tire and into crevices, and still allow the pigment to have its very, very matte, dusty appearance, which the oil paints don't necessarily provide. And then once the enamel spirits have completely and totally dried, I'll come through using a Q-tip or my finger and clean up any excess from the surface. And in this instance, I want to make sure that the contact area of the tire is nice and dark, while there's plenty of pigment in the actual tread of the tire itself. I'll also use this technique in the bed of the truck as well as the interior cab, where people are getting in with dusty, dirty boots, and also the runners on the side by the cab. And if I've applied too much enamel spirits, I will simply grab some more pigment and put it where I think it is needed. And I'll do the same thing on the underside of the vehicle using the toothpick technique to get a random application of the pigments, and I'll come through after with the white spirits to lock it in place and have it flow around so it's not just speckles of dust sitting on the surface. Once that's all dried, I will grab some more of the dust-colored oil paint and some white spirits to mix up a dust wash. This will lock all of that pigment into place, as simply applying the white spirits earlier allows it to flow on the surface, but it doesn't actually keep the pigment locked in place. So if you want to remove it, you can using a Q-tip or your finger, but this will permanently lock the pigment in place and also give some tonal variation to it as well. With the dusting on the underside done, it's time to move on to the side of the vehicle, the top surface. I've already done the passenger side, and let's do the driver's side together. I'm going to grab the same dust-colored oil paint, and I'm just going to add dots around the side of the vehicle, vaguely where the dust buildup would be, and I will stipple it into the surface using a number 6 brush and white spirits, of course. Now, you can apply this in layers. Like the rust chipping technique that we talked about earlier, it's best to apply a little bit, see if you're happy with the result, and come back and apply more if you feel that you need more. If you want a thinner layer of dust, you can apply more white spirits and have a wetter brush. But if you want a thicker layer, apply more paint, use less white spirits, but I would still suggest using multiple layers. With the weathering complete on the pickup, it's time to focus on the ZU-23-2, and I'm applying a US Modern Army Vehicles wash here from Ammo by Meng. Just simple wash to highlight some of the fine details on this. I like using a fine brush when I go apply washes, that way I don't have a lot of excess to clean up. Fairly targeted in my approach as well. And then of course, to remove any excess, I'm going to be using a flat wide brush damp with enamel spirits and rub the excess away from the surface, leaving the wash in the crevices. And with the wash applied on the ZU-23-2, it's time to mix up another dust wash and apply it in the crevices on the pickup itself. And one little final detail, I like using this starship-based sludge on vehicles to create dead bug marks, similar to the rust streaking technique I used earlier. I'm just going to make small little dots of this color and streak them out using a brush, the same brush, damp with enamel spirits, to create little marks of where bugs have been hit by the front of the vehicle. And with that done, it is time to move on to final assembly. So let's get the wiper blades installed. I'm going to be using Ammo by Meg's Ultra Glue just because I don't want to use any CA glue near the windshield here, as I don't want it fogging up. With the wipers installed and the antenna in place, the pickup itself is done, and all that's left is to put the ZU-23-2 finally in place. I'm going to be using VMS's Flexi 5K CA for this process. It's probably my favorite CA glue when it comes to gluing PE or resin together. With the ZU-23-2 permanently in place, it's time to add a few accessories like this water jug, a couple water bottles, and of course an extra ammo can. And with all of the little accessories in place, the pickup is finally done. All that's left now is to make a base for it, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on the whole process of making a base for your scale model. I'm just going to go for something fairly simple for this one, but so far I'm very happy with how this turned out, and enjoy a little showcase of the finished model.